I'm going to introduce and try to summarize some of the key ideas in my book, The Enclosure of Knowledge, which I believe is being circulated. So very simply, it is a book about the relationship between books, knowledge, and labour. And specifically, it's a history of how printed farming books were stimulated by and contributed to the capitalist mode of farming that developed in England and then later in Scotland during the 17th and 18th centuries by helping to transform what I call the social system of knowledge. So it's primarily about the role of agricultural books like these, trying to better understand why they were produced and what impact they had on rural society. So let me begin with this image on the front of this book here. It was the frontispiece to an agricultural treatise published in 1756 and was titled The Goddess Ceres in Her Chariot Drawn by Dragons, Teaching Mankind the Art of Husbandry. This is the cover of my book as well. So you can see that Ceres here is presenting a scroll with the book's title to a ploughman. Now, this is the earliest image I've found that explicitly shows a farmer acquiring knowledge from a written source. It was adapted from a classical myth. The Roman goddess Ceres was the goddess of cultivation and fertility and was believed to have introduced the knowledge of agriculture to human civilization. But in the traditional story, the gift of agriculture, the gift of knowledge, was represented in terms of objects, a sheaf of wheat or perhaps a tool like a scythe. So the insertion of a text here in this myth is very significant. While it's partly a promotional boast about the book itself, about Hale's particular book, the descriptive title of the illustration clearly establishes its wider meaning. The engraving therefore positions books as the source, the origin, perhaps the ultimate origin of agricultural knowledge, and in doing so, I think signals a really profound change in this period. Now, this was a change in the form of knowledge, but this has not really been taken sufficiently seriously in histories of agricultural literature. So in the following, I want to try to explain why this was a fundamental change in the system of agricultural knowledge and explore the motives driving it and the impact that it had. So why my title? Why the enclosure of knowledge? So it's a metaphor that's deliberately chosen to try to reframe books as devices that can help to control knowledge rather than our usual view of books as liberators of knowledge. More specifically, in the context of agriculture, it's a very useful analogy with the more well-known process of the enclosure of land, which transformed land from a communally managed resource requiring some kind of collective decision-making to a privately managed resource allowing individual control. Similarly, agricultural books facilitated a shift away from a communal to a more individualized system of knowledge by packaging up customary knowledge into a private resource. But it's more than a mere analogy, because the enclosure of land and knowledge were companion processes in the formation of capitalist agriculture. Greater control over enclosed land for landowners could only really be effective if they were able to exercise control over knowledge. Printed farming books were highly conducive to a competitive system of farming in which individual market-orientated cultivators were in full control over their fields and could both acquire and apply knowledge independently from custom. So in the rest of my talk then, this is what I'm going to cover. So I want to look at the theoretical frameworks for thinking about this topic, about the relationship between books, knowledge, and labour. I'll then discuss some of the key context for early modern England and Britain, thinking about the term mystery of husbandry. I'll then cover really the core argument in the book, which is about books as a tool of appropriation, followed by a quick outline of how knowledge was codified into books. And I'll then look at the main social consequences in terms of the division of mental and manual labour, which was facilitated by this new managerial knowledge, followed by a little look at thinking about problems and resistance to this new kind of book farming. So before diving in, basic context that you need to know is that the number of publications in English on agriculture increased significantly from the mid-17th to the late 18th century, partly following general publishing trends, but actually outstripping the average. So we can ask a couple of simple questions about this. What was driving the writing of more and more agricultural books, and what impact did this have? Now, this question has usually been understood by historians according to one main paradigm that I call the Enlightenment model, which fits printed books within a narrative of a wider agricultural enlightenment. So this interpretive framework has been driven primarily by a preoccupation with trying to explain an agricultural revolution, usually defined as a rapid increase in productivity over a few decades. So historians concerned with that question about the spread of innovations leading to increases in productivity have primarily analysed books in terms of their role in disseminating useful knowledge leading to such innovations. So the basic research question for over half a century has essentially remained the same, which is, what contribution did books make to agricultural improvement and therefore to the agricultural revolution? However, the results have been rather disappointing. When early modern agricultural books have been examined in any detail, they appear to have been rather poor transmitters of useful knowledge to practicing farmers. So many books were largely repackagings of old ideas. They were overly speculative and fanciful. Many authors lacked practical farming experience. And we simply lack really sufficient evidence that they were widely owned or read by working farmers below the gentry. So the result is that books have often been reduced to a more symbolic role as indicators of at least a desire for knowledge among some people. Most recently, Peter Jones's 2016 book, Agricultural Enlightenment, adopted Joel McKeer's framework and presents the most sustained analysis of agricultural knowledge we have, helpfully, I think, articulating and theorizing many long-held assumptions. But even Jones concedes that the evidence indicates that, quote, the mechanics of innovation and adoption were unconnected or only very loosely connected to the written word. So after decades of pursuing the same question, therefore, we are left with increasingly sophisticated analysis offering ever weaker conclusions. A fundamental theoretical problem is that this paradigm is based essentially on a model of knowledge diffusion, whereby knowledge flows from a centre out to a periphery. Right, it is implicitly a one-way, top-down process from experts to practitioners, and it makes the mistake of treating both knowledge and books as if they were socially neutral entities. And then social questions are added in afterwards as a kind of caveat or qualification. So in the Enlightenment model, the fact that there was very low literacy among farmers in this period is treated as a kind of unfortunate barrier to the diffusion of knowledge, as if agricultural authors finished their 400-page tome full of classical references and Latin, and then only realized, oh no, this is not really in the best format to teach farm laborers. The fact that agricultural books were mostly written and read by the gentry and professionals was not a design flaw, it was a design feature. So they packaged a particular kind of knowledge for a particular kind of social group. So my intervention into this topic is to say that we need to foreground the social dimension rather than only addressing it as a kind of background interference that slows down the process of enlightenment. So a good illustration of the shift I want to make is actually to look at the photograph on the cover of the recent book by Peter Jones. It's a very good book, by the way. I just want to say that it's, in some ways, it's the best example of a paradigm that has run its course, and I want to change the conversation. So the photograph shows a monument to Mathieu de Dombasle in a French village of Roville, where he established a model farm in the 19th century. And it shows a kind of enlightened man of science leading the way in advancing the art of agriculture for the humble and ignorant ploughman. Now, the Enlightenment model is primarily interested in the Dombasle, this man at the top, and his contribution to changing agricultural methods. In contrast, I am interested in the relationship between these two figures and the social groups they represent, on opposite sides of a basic division between mental and manual labour. Dombasle is almost literally a pure head. He has no limbs. He doesn't need any because he doesn't do any work. And this figure here doesn't really need a head. He just looks for his direction from his superior. Now, if we look at what 18th century agricultural authors wrote, we can see that any project of enlightenment was always a project of social as well as technological reform. So here are a few lines from a typical passage by Arthur Young, the most influential English agricultural writer of the day, from 1770. So I quote, "It is the business of the nobility and gentry who practice agriculture, and of authors who practice and write on it, to help forward the age, to endeavour to quicken the motions of the vast but unwieldy body, the common farmers. But to omit this is to reduce themselves to the level of those whom they ought to instruct. Common farmers love to grope in the dark. It is the business of superior minds to shine forth to dissipate the night that involves them." Now, an abstract model of knowledge diffusion is hopelessly inadequate for trying to analyse the social dynamics at play here. This is fundamentally, irreducibly a social vision of what agriculture should be. It's not simply about innovation or productivity. This is about power. This is about the relationship between the nobility and the gentry on the one hand and the common farmers on the other, and it's an explicit attempt to establish a very clear hierarchy of knowledge and expertise. The gentry must be the teachers, the common farmers must be the pupils. So this leads on to my wider argument. So I want to sort of very briefly sketch the alternative approach and narrative that I lay out in my book. So to do this quickly and simply, I'm going to make it very crude and schematic and highlight 4 different ways that my approach differs. So the first basic conceptual shift away from the Enlightenment model is to say that book knowledge is not simply a technical power, it's not simply a power over nature, but a social power, a power over people. And rather than focusing on questions of productivity, my research question is, how did books contribute to changes in the division of labour? So rather than studying the increase or diffusion of knowledge, then I turn attention to the social reorganisation of knowledge. How and for whom agricultural knowledge was produced, stored, transferred, exercised, and legitimated. And rather than contextualizing books with respect to an agricultural revolution, I explore how books contributed to the development of new social relations, which I group together under the umbrella of agrarian capitalism. So let's consider some of the key context of early modern Britain and England in particular. So what was the social structure of knowledge in 1500? So in England in the 16th century, around 2/3 of the population were engaged in agriculture, and land ownership was fairly widespread. Typical farm was a small family farm in which, crucially, those who made decisions, i.e. exercised knowledge, were usually those who were also performing the tasks themselves. There was a kind of a unity of head and hand, if you like. Most landowners simply collected rents and had relatively little interest in day-to-day farming. There are exceptions, of course, but this is the broad picture. And crucially, this is a general characterization, but crucially the knowledge and skills required to grow food and raise livestock, which we can call the art of husbandry, was mostly acquired through labour. It was stored in customary practices, and it was transferred orally and by demonstration. The written word played a relatively negligible role in teaching and learning how to farm. This view is neatly articulated in an imagined dialogue by a poet, so we can't take it too seriously. But in this dialogue, the character of the countryman asks, "What more learning have we need of, but that experience will teach us without book? We can learn to plough and harrow, sow and reap, plant and prune, thrash and feign, winnow and grind, brew and bake, and all without book. And these are our chief business in the country. So to explore this idea of learning without books a bit further, we can look at a key phrase in the early modern period called the mystery of husbandry. Now, the term mystery was partly synonymous with terms like art and craft, but also meant a skill understood as a kind of property, and which signaled a kind of possession of both knowledge but also membership of a craft community. It could refer specifically to a kind of set of secrets about the natural world, known only to those apprenticed in the craft, and because of that it was closely connected to a genre of books called books of secrets. Pamela Smith has described such books as an attempt to put into writing the tacit experiential knowledge of craftspeople. And Smith has also described this kind of knowledge as an artisanal epistemology, which attempts to capture the kind of whole way of knowing linked to the production of things, which cannot easily be fully transmitted in writing. Now, husbandry, or agriculture, or farming, whatever term we use, is generally excluded from histories of crafts, books of secrets, and artisanal knowledge. But the term mystery was used in relation to farming as well. So it was a term used, for example, by John Cannon in his memoirs when he's recounting his experience of being a young farm worker in Somerset in the late 17th century. By age 16, he wrote that he had, quote, attained under the vigilance of my parents the whole mystery of husbandry. And this phrase summarised for Cannon the whole process of learning through labour, through personal practical experience under the direct tutelage of experienced adults. And it's therefore quite significant that many books around this time were published claiming to have discovered or to be revealing the mystery of husbandry. For example, this is the title page to John Wallige's 1669 agricultural treatise, Systema Agricultura, was in the subtitle. And there are kind of half a dozen others in this kind of period as well that also refer to discovering or revealing the mystery of husbandry. Beyond this, scholars in various disciplines have for a long time recognized the very distinctive type of knowledge that peasant communities possess in the modern world. So studies in rural sociology, for example, have generally established that farming is a very complex and dynamic system in which the same situation never occurs precisely. The learning process is at best understood as kind of experiential rather than experimental. And therefore farmers develop a kind of knowledge that can be applied to a series of non-identical situations. So it's kind of called situated expertise. So in this view, farming knowledge cannot be easily reduced to a list of written instructions, because good farming is about making appropriate judgments in an ever-changing environment. So I think such sort of modern scholarship offers support for what I will call a peasant epistemology. I don't have a full theory about this, but I simply want to make the fairly, I think, uncontroversial claim that early modern husbandmen and housewives would have possessed a certain kind of situated expertise, and this maps on quite well to contemporary notions of the mystery of husbandry. So the key point then is the majority of people working in farming had little need of books to tell them how to farm. So who needed these books, right? So to begin to answer that question, we need to look at how that situation is recurring. Okay. We need to look at how social and economic changes were transforming the organizational structure of farming from the 16th to the 18th centuries. So, in a nutshell, and the details and the chronology of this are all disputed, but the trajectory is fairly well accepted. Land ownership became more concentrated over these centuries. The average farm size tended to increase. The number of landless wage labourers increased. And landowners became more active in estate management and home farming. So the typical farm tended to become the large commercial farm, relying on hiring teams of wage labourers. Now, the cumulative effect over the centuries was that managerial control over cultivation was gradually concentrated in the upper levels of the rural community. And you get this expanding strata, this expanding managerial class of landowners, estate managers, or just sort of large tenant farmers. So there was, in other words, a gradual separation between the intellectual labour, mental labour of a manager and the manual labour of the wage workers. And of course, this necessarily must have involved a reorganisation in knowledge and the structure of knowledge. Those in managerial positions needed to gain greater control over knowledge in order to apply it in the production process and exert full control over their workers. So that leads on to sort of part 3 and my sort of key argument. So I want to say that we should see agricultural books as much as a tool of appropriation as dissemination. So books were not simply vehicles carrying knowledge top down from so-called experts to practitioners, but were also a tool and a product of a kind of bottom-up appropriation by learned culture. Ultimately, the growth of agricultural books facilitated the polarization of knowledge in the occupational structure, mirroring the polarization in land ownership. And I mean appropriation in two senses. Both the collection of existing knowledge of the art, but also the reimagining of this low, vulgar art into a high literary science suitable for gentlemen. Now, a key aspect of the gentry appropriation of agriculture was to systematically discredit the vast majority of existing farmers and farm workers who followed customary methods. So from the mid-17th century onwards, writers were increasingly likely to critique the existing knowledge and expertise of practicing husbandmen. And this, the claim is repeated again and again in the 18th century that agriculture had made slow progress because it was in the hands of peasants. So, for example, in 1756, Francis Home, who was a physician, introduced his treatise by stating, quote, "This art is, in general, carried on by those whose minds have never been improved by science, taught to make observations or draw conclusions in order to attain the truth, who can never know more than what they have learned from their fathers. What can be expected from that class?" So agricultural improvers such as Home expressed the rather counterintuitive idea that farming should not be left in the hands of mere farmers, or at least not without proper supervision, because they did not know how to do it in the correct, enlightened manner. Now, while educated gentlemen were critical of husbandmen, this did not change the fact that they were themselves, as a group, largely ignorant and had very little practical experience. Writers were just as likely to be lawyers or physicians or merchants. So for a gentleman who had not been brought up on a farm and could not lower himself to learn through labour, the most direct way to learn was by observing and conversing with people with more experience. Such information could then be stored and shared in a textual form for other gentlemen. An example publication where this is quite clear is Observations in Husbandry by Edward Lisle, a clergyman landowner who compiled a commonplace book with notes on farming from the 1690s. His son later published his observations, which helpfully kind of retained their note-like form, which included indications of where he got his information, which was a blend of advice from reading classical authors, talking to neighbouring farmers and his own servants, and doing some of his own experiments. So, for example, many pieces of information will be preceded with the phrase, "My bailiff, who was many years a farmer, assures me," or "My threshers assured me the reason was ... or "A very good dairy woman in Leicestershire assured me," or "My servant was observing to me," etc., etc. You get the point. So Lisle seems to be fairly typical of sort of curious gentlemen who tried to learn what they could from those around them, including their servants. Now, this sort of information gathering of men like Lisle has been kind of celebrated, I think, without really acknowledging what's happening here, which is that the knowledge of those at the bottom of the social scale was being slowly accumulated into a form that could be managed by those at the top. The rationale for doing this, for writing down customary knowledge, was sort of neatly articulated by William Marshall in the 1780s. And he said, in short, the art of agriculture must ever remain imperfect while it is suffered to languish in the memory and die with the practitioner. Record only can perpetuate the art, and system alone render the science comprehensive. So in his mind, therefore, customary knowledge had to be recorded and systematized for any progress to be made. Now, it's important to note that in some ways the intentions of the authors are to some extent irrelevant. The basic point is that any project to systematically collect agricultural knowledge in written form would overwhelmingly benefit a fairly small minority of people in a society like early modern Britain. Now, this was not only an appropriation across social classes, but also in a more complicated fashion across gender. So women performed around 1/3 of all agricultural work and obviously possessed the requisite knowledge and skills to do so. Whereas agricultural authors were almost entirely male, and the majority of those in managerial positions tended to be male, although of course not everyone. Now, in the case of dairying, this has already been highlighted in a brilliant article by Deborah Valens from 1991 on how the women's art of dairying was appropriated by men of business in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And we see this in books like Dairying Exemplified from 1784 by a cheese factor called Josiah Twamley, who dealt in buying and selling cheese and was therefore able to gain access to kind of tightly knit dairying communities. As a male author, he could not claim to possess direct practical experience of an activity that was traditionally performed by women, so he actually had to be quite open about his reliance on the knowledge of dairy women. Hence, the title states that the rules were collected from the most experienced dairy women. He also described the skeptical responses he would receive. For example, what does he know of dairying, or how should a man know anything of cheese making? Now, Twamley's response was that he was applying a superior reason. So he criticised, quote, the general way that the art of dairying has been carried on for ages, being taught by mother to daughter from common and continual experience without ever calling in the assistance of philosophy. So despite his clear dependence on the knowledge of experienced dairy women, the patriarchal context meant that it was fairly straightforward for a male author to sort of claim intellectual superiority and appropriate their knowledge and then use this to exert greater control. Now, the appropriation I am describing was not a simple process of just writing down what was customary knowledge. The process of codification, by which I mean the articulation of knowledge in a fixed and standardized form, necessarily involves the selection and adaptation of practical knowledge. So up to the 17th century, agricultural writing was primarily a distillation of experience and customs. But in the 18th century, we see new attempts to codify knowledge in a way that establishes the primacy of writing and the primacy of written knowledge. So authors increasingly challenged the idea that expertise in farming came through performing farm work. So I've identified sort of four dominant modes of organizing knowledge based on having a system or a theory, or based on experiments or observations. Forgive some of the fonts on here, it's displaying slightly differently than it did on my laptop. So these sort of modes that I've identified were combined in the same book, so it's not really a genre, but more a style of organizing information. So I'll try and be fairly quick covering these, but the first was what I call the kind of systematic mode. So this prioritized gathering and ordering information from diverse sources into a single coherent system. It aimed to be complete and to apply universally to all farms everywhere. And it adopted an overview that tried to link all the parts together in an orderly way. A good illustration of this is the schematic diagram here in a style sort of popular at the time, which represents agricultural knowledge as an abstraction, as a kind of totality in a manner sort of largely divorced from practical considerations. So it's not designed to be a how-to manual, but just show a system. The frontispieces to sort of many books display the kind of clear desire for this synoptic perspective, which is the perspective of the landowner or the estate manager. However, books like this were still largely derived from customary labour-based knowledge. The other modes are slightly different. So the theoretical mode, in contrast, was a direct challenge to custom because it prioritised constructing theoretical principles independent from farming practice, that's the key bit, from which then good practice is derived. So the most important development was the introduction of ideas from chemistry, primarily by Scottish physicians. So going back to our man Francis again and his principles of agriculture, Home argued that the practice of farming, or the art of husbandry, did not lead to a theory of itself. Therefore, quote, something beyond this art is necessary to the knowledge of the art itself. This is a relatively radical idea at the time, the notion that a true knowledge of farming could not be acquired by doing farming, could not be acquired from practice. You need something else. So the consequence then is that the practical farmer either needs to become a chemist or learn chemistry, or they need to become dependent on an outside expert, which tends to be the trend. The experimental mode was a slightly more subtle shift. An important distinction emerged in the 17th century through the work of the Royal Society and others between experience, acquired through time and practice, and experiment, which is the report of a discrete event. Experiment was a structured, recorded experience capable of being integrated into a system of knowledge. Agricultural writing in the sort of experimental mode therefore prioritized sort of artificial forms of practice, coordinated and recorded by writing, formally distinct from daily farm experience. The enthusiasm for experiments is kind of epitomized by Arthur Young's enormous 2-volume Course of Experimental Agriculture from 1770, which claimed to register 2,000 experiments. And what's crucial here is that Young argued that in agricultural writing, experience must be the structure itself, not the foundation. So in other words, it wasn't enough to write down what you had learned through experience. The writing itself must be structured as a record of carefully designed experiments. So again, what this means is that experience alone is insufficient. It has to be written down in an orderly fashion to become proper knowledge. The observational mode was similar, but prioritized written observations over direct experience. So rather than record particular experiments, the observational mode offered systematized record of general best practice. And this is illustrated quite well by the work of William Marshall, who we've already met. Especially in his first book, Minutes of Agriculture from 1778, which included a kind of diary-like report. So according to Marshall, quote, the experience of agriculture is acquired through adequate observation, either on self-practice or on the practice of others. So self-practice means kind of personal experience. So this may sound like a kind of technical point, but I think underpins the shift in the concept of expertise. The true expert in farming must now be the manager who observes, records, reflects, and systematizes all labours on the farm. The direct experience of people doing the labour is again inadequate. It does not achieve knowledge. So in summary then, authors were not simply writing down what was in customs. And they weren't simply trying to produce new ideas, but to establish writing as the supreme form of knowledge, right? And to displace labour as the foundation of knowledge. Right? Labour was no longer the route to acquiring proper knowledge of agriculture. Okay, so let's kind of review some of the key points so far. So one, practical farming cannot be fully codified without loss or distortion, and therefore books cannot teach you everything you need to know about how to actually run a farm. 2, the creation and the demand for books was driven by the need for gentlemen, who were mostly ignorant amateurs, to learn the best of what common farmers already knew. And 3, this knowledge was codified in specific ways in order to serve the interests of educated men and those in managerial positions. The result is that books essentially contained what I would call managerial knowledge. They did not contain everything you needed to farm successfully, but they did contain useful information about how to plan and direct the labour of others, but which is still dependent on the practical knowledge and skills of workers to implement it. So many books are quite explicit about this. So for example, Reverend John Trussler, who wrote books about all sorts of topics, explained that his Practical Husbandry from 1780 was not written for instructing men early bred to husbandry, but to give gentlemen who may think proper to use a certain quantity of land, either for amusement or convenience, such an insight into the nature of farming as will enable them to check the negligence, correct the ignorance, or detect the imposition of servants. Not all books are targeted in exactly this same way, but it highlights the general point. Many of these books were primarily aimed at readers who were mostly going to be managers. They didn't need to know how to plough a field themselves, but they did need to know how to make decisions in order to organise their ploughing. As such, these books were primarily useful on farms with a significant division of labour and a general separation between mental and manual labour. So the overall kind of vision was stated very clearly by Thomas Robertson in a book on farm sizes, a report on farm sizes, from 1796. So quite extraordinarily, in discussing the ideal farmer, he says the second characteristic of a farmer is that he does not perform manual labour. Now this overturned the last few centuries. Farmers were defined by performing manual labour, and men like Robinson say, no. The farmer does not perform manual labour. Farming is a liberal art and consists in appointing and superintending labour. And in fact, it is less laborious to do a thing than to tell others what to do, how to do, and to see it done. Were the farmer to hold his own plough and perform the other menial exercises, he could not have time to make observations, to think, to read, to go to markets, to meet with his neighbours, to ride through the parish and the country, and so on and so on. So the farmer's time must be freed up and dedicated fully to managerial activities. The growing kind of separation between mental and manual labour on farms is, I think, very clearly captured in this really striking taxonomy of manual labour, which was created by John Charles Loudon in 1826. So Loudon tried to conceptually separate tasks that required some thinking and tasks that required no thinking or did not require much thinking. Such divisions were being created on larger farms, hiring more workers, but this was facilitated by the widespread availability of printed books, which helped to concentrate knowledge and decision-making in managerial roles. Now, this tendency in agriculture was part of a much wider and longer historical development linked to the rise of the new sciences and capitalist mode of production, which Harry Braverman, I'm not sure if he's in fashion at the moment, but he wrote about this in the 1970s and argued that the separation of hand and brain is the most decisive single step in the division of labour taken by the capitalist mode of production. Owners and managers had to gain control over all factors of production, not only land and labour, but knowledge too, in order to be able to reorganise production in the pursuit of greater productivity and profits. The division between productive bodies and managing minds is usually associated with the use of machine technology in 19th, 20th century manufacturing, but which I think we can see happening in 18th century farming assisted by books. Now in the final section, I want to quickly mention some of the problems created by the increasing use of books and the resistance to them by looking at the kind of book farming controversy. Now, the term book farming emerged as a pejorative in the late 18th century and meant the practice of farming with knowledge chiefly acquired from books. This had a kind of a weak and a strong meaning. So in a weak sense, it was used by agricultural writers themselves to criticize books that were too theoretical, too speculative, or a kind of naive over-reliance on books. In fact, there were so many books considered to be useless that it became an object of satire. So, I'm not even sure I can pronounce this word, but the Giorgio Bosco Filario graphometer was a joke, but supposedly a mathematical instrument, which on being applied to the title page of any treatise, either on tillage or cattle, will immediately show, by the motion of a certain volatile spirit in a glass tube hermetically sealed, the precise quantity of nonsense it contains. And forgive my experiment with AI here to an appropriately fake image for a fake instrument. So this is a fairly common idea that many of these books were a bit crap, but there was a stronger critique of book farming as expressed by common farmers, which seemed to reject the very idea of books as a way of learning about farming. Now, we mostly have evidence of this attitude indirectly. So, for example, in 1770, Charles Varlow wrote that, and he was a writer of agricultural books, he wrote that old-fashioned farmers would scorn to be book farmers, and he shared a kind of typical response that he would receive. Shall a gentleman, because he can write, pretend to instruct me what to do with my land? Does he know better than myself, who has been brought up to farming business all my lifetime, and perhaps on the same land too? A pretty joke indeed. So this quote was actually part of a repeated complaint that common farmers were either hostile or indifferent to agricultural books. But in the context I've set out, I think we have good reason for not dismissing this as just signs of ignorance or backwardness amongst farmers, but instead signs of a defence of custom and the kind of peasant epistemology I outlined earlier. Indeed, the debates about book farming were not simply debates about the nature of farming knowledge, but were also expressions of competing class interests. So the clearest example of this wider significance is an anti-enclosure pamphlet published from 1785. What is so striking is that despite the main argument being about the price of butcher's meat, the pamphlet offered a very fierce and detailed critique of agricultural writers and books in the opening sections of the pamphlet, arguing that most authors misunderstood the art of agriculture, the knowledge of which was inherently local and practical, and so could not easily be written down in big manuals. But also that books and authors disrupted social relations by proclaiming authority on dubious foundations, by undermining the existing expertise of common farmers, and encouraging amateurs to invest in farming in the hopes of massive profits. A couple of points are worth highlighting. So first, the author observed that common farmers and labourers deliberately hid their knowledge from gentlemen, asking about their methods. Quote, farmers aim at making a mystery of their business in conversation with gentlemen. It gives the clown meaning common farmer, servant, cottager, labourer. It gives the clown pleasure to delude and mislead the gentleman in his notions of farming. And this disposition arises partly from a jealousy lest the gentleman should know as much as himself. This is a clear statement of a really underlying class conflict over knowledge, as it indicates that the clowns were acutely aware that sharing their knowledge of their craft, of their art, may threaten their position. And this developed into a general critique of the social evils of arising from the publication of agricultural treatises. The main evil of books was their tendency to mislead the legislature. So the author wrote, I am convinced that many acts of parliament have been passed of late years upon the false principles which these books have inculcated. So the important point is that the pamphleteer was not simply aiming to attack the substantive arguments about enclosure and its effects, but to undermine the authority on which those arguments were based. So this was a very defiant response to the appropriation of knowledge and the social upheaval created by book farming. So in examples like this, we see that knowledge was not simply diffusing throughout society. Instead, two visions of agriculture opposed each other. Two visions about how the cultivation of England should be managed and by whom. Right? Either by farmers who have gained knowledge and skills through practical experience, by years of labour on the same land, or by enlightened gentlemen who believed themselves to be in possession of superior scientific knowledge and had a book with them. I'm just going to wrap up, yeah. Okay, so let me conclude that. So if we think back to the Enlightenment model, it has almost nothing to say about the many issues that I've raised today, since any question about the wider social function of books is immediately foreclosed by reducing them to the role of just carriers of useful knowledge. This is at best partial and at worst misleading. If agricultural books did begin to approximate the role demanded of them toward the end of the 18th century as disseminators of knowledge, this was only a result of a long and contested social upheaval. So in summary then, my argument is that the embodied knowledge of husbandry, held widely in customary practice and oral tradition by a semi-literate population, was gradually codified, enabling the partial appropriation of the art by learned men who sought to monopolize agricultural book knowledge to exert greater control over labour in managerial positions as landowners, stewards and large farmers. So in doing so, books facilitated the polarization of knowledge and expertise. Therefore, the 17th and 18th centuries, the favourite period for an agricultural revolution and enlightenment, cannot simply be described in terms of an increase in knowledge and its gradual dissemination. Instead, the dissemination of codified knowledge needs to be understood within a context in which there was a fundamental transformation of the social system of knowledge that attempted to subordinate a labour-based system beneath a book-based system.